How's it going, everyone? And welcome to the Bot Podcast, where we interview movers, shakers, and innovators and talk all things conversational user interfaces. I'm your host, Chad Oda, and today we have a very special guest, Antoine Raux. Antoine is the co-founder and CTO of B4.AI, and they're based out of San Francisco. B4.AI's goal is to make voice tech more human-friendly by building conversational agents that support natural, frictionless interactions between humans and machines. Antoine has an extensive resume of experience with the research and design of speech-based and multimodal human-machine interfaces. Most recently, he was a research assistant at Facebook and a principal researcher at Lenovo. He also holds a PhD in language and information technologies from Carnegie Mellon. So at that, Antoine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hey, Chad. Hi, everyone.
So before we get started into sort of the more specific questions, I always like to ask sort of a unique question based upon our guest's sort of background. So from your perspective, how has conversational UI evolved, being that you've been in the space, really since the early 90s? And I think many of us have just only seen this emergence of conversational UI, through some of these platforms like Dialogflow or more simple rule-based ones such as Chatfield or MiniChat. Even though that, it's probably taken many years of research, breakthroughs, and experiences that really drove the platforms that we see today.
Yeah, thanks. Just one note, I'm not that old exactly. It's more like the late 90s than the early.
Late 90s.
But yeah, so it's been very interesting. I feel, and it's not at all going in a kind of linear, monotonous way. I feel the progress in the area. Like coming from academia, there was a lot of work in the like around 2000, late 90s, 2000 on kind of classical AI-ish, if you know what that means, which is like the AI before machine learning, before data-driven. So all kind of planning approaches, and it's basically that's where it started from in a way. But that actually has a lot of, I think, implications with what's happening now too, right? It's been kind of pushed aside for a bit, and at least combined, but mostly pushed aside, I would say, in favor of like pure data-driven approaches since then. But I feel that now, if you're out there trying to build something that really works, you're kind of going back to, we kind of have to go back to that. And so revisiting this, 20-year-old technology is kind of very interesting to today, I would say. And I think it has had a hard time to transfer from academic settings to products. That's something that's kind of, I'm kind of puzzled by how hard it's kind of a difficult problem. So it's not, the transfer itself is hard, but that's kind of what I feel what I want to help achieve. Like even 20 years later, I still want to have that, plus everything that has happened in between, and push that from like prototypes in labs to actual products. And I think it's a big challenge, but there's a lot of things that happen. I think the big trend in general, as always, is from more rule-based, but rule-based tend to have a really bad connotation, particularly in academic circles. But if you think of planning and plan-based approaches, it doesn't mean that it's, just if-then, rules and that's it, right? It can be fairly advanced. But from that to purely data-driven machine learning approaches to probably hybrids, which is what we should have now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really unique perspective that I think most of us don't really have in this space at this point. I think a lot of people sort of, initial salvos into the space were sort of jumping into, a rule-based bot or, playing around with IBM Watson, so I think it really is interesting to sort of hear sort of these successive steps, even if it's not sort of this linear evolution, which, I think many things in the technology space rarely are. I think it's really interesting to sort of see how, research papers that are going back, 10, 20 years are really beginning to underlie a lot of the innovations that we're seeing today.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point.
So rolling to some initial questions here, why don't you talk about sort of the customer need / market opportunity that B4.AI is solving?
It's an interesting point. Like we're starting from the idea that there aren't really, I mean, it wasn't true a year ago when we started, but it's still not very true today, that there aren't really satisfying conversational applications out there, but bots or otherwise, but like truly conversational as in natural conversation, even though that's been kind of promised and touted as kind of the holy grail of UX or something like that. But it's not happening. It hasn't happened at all. And so that's the first thing we kind of started from and noticed. And so I think the first thing we want to do is show, like, build technology that enables this kind of thing, and as a first step, show what could be. Because I feel that we don't have, and consumers and both consumers and developers and people in the field don't really have, and even us, don't really have a good feel for what could be if we really push that conversation, natural conversation kind of a thread forward. What would the end, not the end, but what would be an advanced user experience like? And the reason I'm saying that I'm convinced that there's going to be a time where we pass a threshold where it's going to suddenly feel extremely natural to the user, to the point that you don't think anymore about the system you're dealing with, because it supports, at least within the domain it's supposed to deal with. There's limitation. You're not talking to a person as a user, but within that you really just speak as you would to a human partner. And
yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. So it our first kind of goal is to build the technology and build that first really good case. And of course, that itself is not an easy task. And then I feel that can go in terms of use case and business applications. I mean, that's a whole story, but our kind of take on this at B4.AI is mostly around voice commerce. So applications that aims at transactions and ordering things. And that's a huge area. And it's also an area where the kind of one-shot interaction that happens with the typical Alexa or Google Assistant still today doesn't really work. Like, if you want to build a shopping cart and place an order, whatever the domain is, you're probably going to need more than one turn of interaction. And having that problem solved through natural dialogue is kind of our longer term goal, I would say.
Definitely. No, I think that was a great overview, especially, since, to your point with Alexa, right? It has like this sort of command and control sort of interface where it's just like this like single turn events. And you're right, we're definitely not even really, near the edge of, I think, sort of this idealized vision of maybe ambient computing, where it's like we don't have to think about, where are sort of the walls in this sort of user interface, right? We can just sort of, have some sort of utterance and be able to sort of navigate sort of effortlessly in that sort of ecosystem. So maybe a good segue that we can start talking about is, if we can maybe talk about, what specifically, I think some of your technology is solving, which is sort of around dialogue state. And if you could sort of talk about, what is dialogue state and why is it important? I think that would definitely, help maybe some of the audience get a better feel and understanding as to, where this can sort of take us into the next evolution of conversational user interfaces.
Okay, sure, yeah. So that was the topic of the medium that you mentioned earlier. And it's, by the way, it's a big topic. Like what I talk about in that medium, what I'm going to talk about now is probably only one aspect of dialogue. Dialogue state is basically what you maintain, at the very least, throughout one conversation. That's kind of the short-term memory of conversation. There's additional things about remembering things from the user between sessions, etc., which can also be very important. But for the purpose of this discussion, it's a dialogue state is just within one conversation. Even if it's the first time the user comes and talks to your system, after 3 turns, it's not the same as the first turn of the interaction. Like, things you've established, or you and the user, the bot and the user have established the context together. We know we're talking about ordering a large Hawaiian pizza, and we're just trying to figure out if they want to customize it or something like that. And so the state is what allows the bot to do 2 things. I mean, there's 2 big tasks that are needed for dialogue. One is understanding the user, and in a real conversation, understanding the user requires a notion of context. I mean, I think I think people probably understand that. And the Dalek state is what is kind of a summary of everything that happened so far that is useful from the bot's perspective to interpret user utterances. And the other aspect of Dalek state is it's used to decide what the bot should do next. Right? Once you've understood the user, you have to decide, okay, now I need to ask about this, I need to confirm this, there's a lot of things that, in theory, your bot could do or could ask. And that's also, the Dalek is critical in kind of deciding that. And that's one thing that I'm learning. In the research community I come from, it's kind of pretty established that these two things are kind of separate. These two tasks are in a way separate, like the understanding part and the kind of action selection part, and that you need this abstract Dalek state to kind of motivate, kind of support both tasks, right? But it's not always it's not the only way to look at the problem for sure. But that's kind of like the core essence of the Dalek state. Now the question is, what should that be? That's basically a big data structure of some kind in your system, right? Potentially very complex. And that's where you see that any kind of multi-turn interaction is going to have some kind of Dalek state, right? Even the simplest one, they have to have some kind of memory, basically. And then the typical approaches is like finite state machines, right? Where you just say, this is my starting state. And then if the user says A, we follow this path. If they say B, follow that path, we end in a different second state. Based on that state, we know that kind of determines what this bot will say next, right? And you just follow this. That's a good way of representing fairly deterministic flows, right? I mean, there's a choice at each point, but there's only a limited number of choices, right? Like the problem with natural conversation is that in theory, your user or anyone can say anything at any time, and you should be able to kind of make sense of it the best you can. That means you can kind of, if you represent that as a set of state like that, you have to be able to jump from any state to any state. And so then the state machine representation doesn't really help much because you just have transition from everywhere to everywhere. And you still have to remember where you came from in order to be able maybe to go back to it. So that structure doesn't really carry on. It's kind of a good way for representing very simple tasks where you kind of follow a fixed path through the dialogue, but it ends up being very rigid from the user perspective, not very natural.
Would you say that's like some of like the chat fuel or like mini chat sort of like rule-based bots? Would that be a definition, finite state?
Yeah, I think that's probably what is underlying. And sometimes it's that plus something else. I mean, even simple frameworks or basic frameworks go sometimes beyond pure finite state machines, because you can see that you need that even for basic things. Like if you're asking the user a city, which city are you living from, and you get the city from the user, you're not going to have a different state for any of the 10,000 different cities they could have mentioned, right? So obviously you have to store that somewhere else than in the state machine. So pretty soon, as soon as you start building real systems, you realize that, yeah, it's not going to be the only thing, but it's kind of what drives the conversation in those kind of finite state machine based systems. And so, yeah, I suspect a lot of those frameworks out there are actually based on that. And then another data structure or approach to state that is very common also is the form, like a form-based approach. And the difference with that is you don't store necessarily a sequence of steps. Basically, instead you store, you represent the state as a number of slots you need to acquire from the user. So for your task, if you want to, again, if you have like a flight information, you want to know where they leave from, where they go to, and which day they want to travel, and maybe a bunch of other pieces of information. They just mark those as slots, and then there's no hard-coded order in which you have to ask those things, or it also allows the user to provide several pieces of information at once. Assuming you have the natural language understanding that supports that to begin with, then you can fill in the slots as they come, and it's a much more flexible already form than the finite state machine. But it kind of depends which task you're dealing with, because it gives very little structure. All you can do with a form typically is, so you can, it's very good for a state update. You can just fill in the slots as they come, whatever the question was almost. And then you have an algorithm that just checks which slots are missing and required, and you just ask that next question. So for that kind of task, it's good, but that's not all the tasks out there either, right? So it's a very specific, and it only works well for fairly limited kind of systems. It could be real system. Like if it's a weather kind of application, that's probably enough, right? But as soon as it gets more complicated, like for example, if you get to something like ordering where you have a number of items, you don't know beforehand how many items it's going to be, and you might have to correct something that was specified before, then the form, they can be a component of your state, but it's not going to be enough to allow for this kind of more complex.
Would you say like those type of models or sort of form with slots is typically what we're seeing with some of the platforms from like IBM Watson or Dialogflow, or that's pretty much that model?
That's what, when I saw like Amazon Lex as well, who very much seem to follow that approach, which it's a pretty good start because it's both the finite state machine and the form, I think, are very easy to conceptually get for people, for someone who would be new to the field and want to build a system quickly. It's pretty easy to get the idea. Doesn't mean it's easy to necessarily build the right structure and the right system on top of it, but at least it kind of makes sense by in a common sense kind of way. And so I think that's one reason why they would use that. All those companies, particularly the big ones, they have scientists who've studied the same thing as I have and know a lot about more complex model of conversation. The problem is it's good to have a complex model of conversation, but how do you have someone build an agent on top of that? That's where it gets very challenging, actually, in general. And that's kind of what we are trying to do here, because we're trying to go beyond these two very typical kind of models of Dalek state to a kind of richer model that allows for these, like, several kind of conversational phenomena, but including if you switch topic, the user kind of can switch topic at any time in the conversation, potentially come back once we're done with dealing with a particular question, we can come back to where we were before. And so, as you can see, this kind of, when I describe it this way, it kind of feels like a stack of topics, which is exactly what we use to represent it, where you talk about something, user brings up another question, you deal with it, and you pop it from the stack, and you're back to where you were before. It's a different kind of memory that is kind of well suited for those kind of more advanced conversation. It's still not the end of it all. I mean, real natural conversation is kind of infinitely complex. So everything is going to be some kind of simplification, but it's one step beyond the things that exist. And again, depending on what task you're trying to achieve in your bot, or depending on what subtask within a particular dialogue you're dealing with, you probably want to combine these different approaches together so that you have the most kind of concise and efficient way of representing what you're trying to do now without sacrificing the flexibility.
Absolutely. I think, you just sort of explaining that, I think probably gives our audience here a lot of context in regards to, what is sort of the status quo right now, and then making the comparison to, how it could be improved, just from sort of spoken language and sort of looking at sort of the nuances of, okay, well, here's a non sequitur here, and where maybe the chatbot was asking for what bank account I want to withdraw from, I ask it, how many airline miles do I have instead that I'm getting credited, right?
Right.
And most bots that are built with FSM or with forms, they have a lot of difficulty addressing those things. Although I've seen some form-based, bots be able to address non sequiturs, I think high density and sort of the stack model it's better at sort of addressing more the non-linearity of conversations, as far as the Medium post that you put out, and also the pizza demo that I was able to take a look at from the company that you guys are running right now.
Yeah, I agree, and I want to kind of put a little caveat, I don't know if it's caveat, but that, again, like I said before, it's not the end of it all, because not all conversations are this kind of stacked topic that are push and pop. You can have conversations that have like two threads at the same time. Like we talk about two topics and we just go between one and the other. So it's not like we deal with one and then we're done, we go to the other. So you can always come up with kind of real natural conversation, not weird things, but just natural conversation that don't fall within each of these models. But it is it's a step forward, like for sure. And for tasks that are kind of specific, like we're not trying to model general conversation either, right? So if you're trying to order a pizza, that becomes a pretty good model for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think sort of going back to something you mentioned as well, right? Sort of making the sort of definition that this is not the end all be all, and that dialogue state specifically sort of addresses the short-term memory, right,
Hmm.
of a conversation. And maybe models that are beyond this in the future are going to be able to address short-term and long-term memory and be able to pull back things from many conversations ago.
That's
And
right. Yeah. Ideally, yeah, you want that. Also, one thing I want to mention, kind of along those lines of more complex and future directions, there's a lot of work now, not surprisingly, in dialogue as in many other areas in deep learning, and there is this notion that you can, how in general deep learning works by having a lot of hidden layers and kind of the network figuring out a lot of the hidden state of whatever problem you're dealing with. It's just a general thing about deep learning, right? And so that there's a feeling that should apply to conversation as well. And you can have a network that where you just feed in whatever is coming from the user at every turn, and it kind of learns what to respond. And internally, just by having a lot of neurons, a lot of layers, it would, in theory, you could figure out a kind of model that works, like kind of representation that works and that reproduces what it's seen in its training data, which is what these things do. And that's theoretically possible. You might need different kind of structures of the neural nets, etc. And there's a lot of actual research work on this. But as of today, the problem is that the space of conversations is really huge. It's a different kind of complexity as the language itself, which is already a huge space, like just the natural language, the space of natural language, basically, which natural language understanding is trying to deal with. But conversation have this additional, on top of that, have this additional complexity that it's an interactive process. So getting the right training data, getting huge amounts of training data is really hard for dialogue. So these kind of pure machine learning approaches, though they're probably, the future, probably sometimes it's going to work. It's not, available right now to kind of build a working product of that level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the interesting thing too is the fact that, something you were sort of alluding to is that, a lot of these models, sort of are 20 years old. I know I've seen some form slot filling research papers from the 1980s, and I know a lot of those sort of research papers sort of underlie some of the platforms that we see today. And then similarly with sort of the stack model, I know that you were mentioning in the Medium article you put out around high density AI, that's also from the 1980s as well.
Yeah.
Why do you think that, it's taken so long to sort of translate a lot of that research, into something commercialized? Because I know that you'd also mentioned that there is a level of, difficulty to sort of make that happen.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering in some way. I've been wondering the same thing for a long time, and I'm thinking that maybe it's because it's right in a no man's land of interest, because you have the pure researchers who love the complexity. That's kind of what they live for, but then they don't probably really want to deal with making things work in the real world, which has so much other kinds of issues that come up, and that you have to sacrifice certain things to make it work. And on the other hand, it's kind of too complex for the pure hackers that would be great at making things work in the real world to take it and build on it. It's something that's I think a little too. It's not that they couldn't, but they would have to study a long time. Like the learning curve is kind of fairly steep. It's not true that much for finite state machines or forms, but for those more complex models, yeah, you have to wrap your head around it, and you have to, not just that, but you have to try it and get experience with it, and so it doesn't lend itself well to just hacking on top of it, I would say. But at the same time, it's not like it's a magical thing where you don't need all the real world effort that the product developer kind of person or team would be able to put in. So maybe it's because it's at that kind of middle ground that's what I like, but I don't think there's always a lot of interest for that. Like if I speak to my researcher friends, they might be wondering why I'm spending so much effort on a pizza application, which doesn't seem exciting to researchers. And if I speak to pure developers, they might be wondering why I spend so much effort on stack-based stuff where it seems you could hack it. It seems you could hack it, in an easier way, which doesn't necessarily generalize. So
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fascinating point, right? Because I think specifically with human to machine and sort of conversational and multimodal interfaces, I think there is like a more of a multidisciplinary need to bring these things successfully to market, right? Because it's not just the technology, it's also language and sort of all of these sub layers that encompass that and are at this foundational level that are just so many nuances, right? That I think you're right. It does make it a little bit more of an obstacle to commercialize these things.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. I think that also explains why there's very few, if any, successful like platforms for actual dialogue.
Hmm.
Like there's pretty good platforms for NLU by now, right? Like since with .ai and the Dalek flow, and so like the intent slot, and you can give data and train. I mean that people now, the more of the general public, or at least developer audience, understands what that is. Those concepts of intent slot, I mean, it's pretty much entered in the kind of general knowledge, and these APIs are really easy to use, and it's well kind of an established thing for NLU.
Mm-hmm.
For conversation, I know that many companies and people have tried similar things. Like, why don't we make that just available to to all developers and hackers out there so they can build awesome conversations? The problem is it doesn't really work, and we haven't figured it out yet. I would say as a community, it's still like designing a conversation is just something that is really hard to do. Like it's not natural, like a natural flexible conversation. I mean, because you don't control the flow. It's not a flow like a UX, like a UI based UX kind of would be. And so if it was a rigid flow, you can draw these finite state machines and people understand that well, but you don't want that. You want something where people can say anything anytime. But how do you even represent that at the design stage, even before talking about technology? It's really complex. It's just a really, still today we haven't found yet the kind of technology or the tools that would make it that easy for anyone to come up and build a natural conversation, because it's not something that is kind of obvious at all to anyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think defining what is a good user experience has seemingly sort of mystified, I think, many in the space right now. I know there are some people in various groups, anywhere from psychologists to script writers to traditional people that practice UX from a academic standpoint, graphical user interfaces. We're all trying to sort of rally together from that sort of perspective. But I think you're also you make a good point too, where it could be a tool or some sort of algorithm too that helps to facilitate that and tie that together. So I find that specific area very, very interesting, because I think there's this over maybe abundance of focus on a lot of the NLU, but it's really the conversational and sort of state management that I think will drive this to this next level.
Yes, I agree. There's sometimes a little bit of confusion by people, particularly people who are kind of new to the area, that NLU is kind of all you need, and that then you're going to be good if you have this perfect intent classification. But I mean, there are specific applications where that's mostly true, probably, but that doesn't give you a conversational application. There's a lot more to it. I mean, NLU is already an awesome and hard problem, right? And it's great that we have pretty good solutions. Though I would also put the caveat that intent slots are not the end of NLU representation. Even like it's a fairly simple representation of language.
Right.
If you start talking about how different entities relate to each other, or you think about parse trees, what like the traditional kind of NLP community looked like, it's actually much more complicated, even just for understanding a sentence, right?
Right.
So it's great that there was, but I think the intent slot representation that's so widespread, it's really great that happened, because that kind of, people have a common language, different companies can start building on that, and everyone understands what they're trying to do. Like if we all had to define parse trees, I think it would be much harder, because like, what they mean and why is it this one rather than this one becomes like really fuzzy at this point, at least. Whereas that achieved that kind of convergence to intent slot, achieved a great thing for making that available. And I think for conversation, if we achieved something like that, which I don't know what it is, I don't think anyone's figured it out, but something, a kind of representation, a kind of scheme, it's not just the technology behind it. There could be several technologies behind it, but the representation itself, something that everyone agrees on and understand what it does, that would probably go a long way to kind of democratizing the natural conversation.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, there's just so many successive steps. So now that we sort of talked about, what you guys are working on at B4.AI today and sort of, the technology, high density, I'd like to sort of go back, maybe to the early beginnings, maybe with your academic career or maybe some of the positions that you've held at, various, enterprise companies from a researcher's perspective. How did you initially get interested or sort of involved in sort of the conversational space to start with?
Yeah, it's a long story, or it's an old story. Well, I got the first contact I had was with voice recognition, speech recognition, and that was basically in 2000 really, that I did an internship in Japan at Toshiba R&D, and I was exposed to just building a speech recognizer with the technology of the day, obviously. But it's not really the technology that fascinates me, although it's pretty cool, but it's something that is so tangible to anyone out there. You talk to a computer, and at the time it was just, you talk to a computer and it can transcribe what you say. It was where I was at the time. This to me is just so cool, and anyone can see how cool it is. That's a big part that's been driving me the whole time until now, I think. The coolness of it. It's still exciting today, right? Because it's far from being sold. It's also a hard problem. But I started with that. Then I basically, how I went to conversations, I did my master's on language learning using computers and using speech recognition, so kind of evaluating fluency and stuff like that. And I thought, well, naively, it's like, well, we should really use that to learn conversation, like learn the foreign language through conversation with a computer. That'd be great. We can practice. And again, that was in 2002. Right. And so I discovered, after that, I wanted to go to do my PhD in that area, and I moved to the US for that. And then I discovered that the Dalek technology was not at all ready for that. That is just having a simple conversation, task-oriented with a native speaker was already kind of hard and not as clean as I hoped it would be. And so I shifted to just say, well, let's just look at that, because that's a big enough problem without dealing with, teaching language at the same time, foreign language at the same time. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then I was hooked. And another thing, an early-ish thing that hooked me during my grad school, is that I built this bus information system as part of my kind of research and to gather data. And we had the kind of unique opportunity and luck that we actually worked. I was in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon, and we worked with the bus company, the transit company in Pittsburgh, the Port Authority of Allegheny County, it's called. And they broke like most bus companies in the US. And so they were happy that we offered them for free a kind of system to replace their human operators at night. We weren't replacing human operators during the day, but at night. And so we just did it. And so I had this chance of having real users, basically, and people who we didn't have to advertise, because people are still calling the bus company number, at any time of the night and day, and they were just reaching us. And so I had this first exposure to having real user use your system, and that's a conversational system. It's simple, getting bus information, but that really hooked me to building real system that real people use and learning from that.
Yeah, was that the Let's Go?
Yes.
Yeah. I was taking a look. I think on I can't remember what university website, but I think it still has like some links on there, and I was trying to play around with it. I'm not sure if it was like still working or not, but I was super interested in sort of learning about it.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's working now. I think the Port Authority ended up at some point paying an actual company to get something commercial, which I don't know if it's better or not, but but we did get like over maybe, I left before, when I left it was still active. We did get maybe 100, 200,000 dialogues, which for an academic site is kind of, for a company, a big company, that'd be 2 days of work. But for an academic site, real users, 200,000 dialogues is like crazy. That's the only time it ever happened. And so again, it was a kind of a really lucky, set of circumstances, and also a lot of hard work. Like as a grad student, I had to actually support the thing and make sure it didn't go down during the night, and kind of as a product, do with the product. But yeah, so that was a kind of great experience in many ways.
Do you mind like sharing like maybe like any because like it's like sometimes you're building these things, but once you finally get new users and actual users that are using it and providing dialogues, you begin to see and come to these realizations about how to design the systems in certain ways, especially with conversational user interfaces. I think once you get real people and you put them in front of, for example, a voice user interface, you start to realize there are these certain things that occur. For example, I know I was talking to another researcher, Julian Harris, and he was telling me he was trying to design this like really basic, addition skill for his son. And, when he was testing it out, it was doing something like, 1+1, and it was asking what the answer is. And his son is then repeating 1+1 to himself, so the skill is looking for the answer, so do you have like any, things like that you guys sort of realized once you started getting like live users and it was like, wow, that's really interesting. It's not something we had anticipated.
Yeah, oh, definitely. There was a lot of that. Now, some of those might not surprise too much people now, but like things. One thing that comes to mind now is how little users listen to what you're saying. So you to what the bot is saying. So we're trying to design part of the research. We're trying to design like helpful prompt and trigger them at the right time and everything. But then you realize that it doesn't matter what you say. Well, it doesn't matter at all. But if you have long prompts, you're sure that they're going to forget the first half. Like they don't even hear it, right? So kind of the basic. We kind of learned the hard way the basic principles of VUI, which wasn't really a thing quite then, right? But that was kind of interesting. Also, things how much it might seem contradictory to what I just said, but it's not. How much the prompt design affects the user response. Like they don't really listen to a lot of information that's provided. But we had this one example which was like. We were giving them help what they could say. It was we kept it fairly conservative. That's another thing we learned is that even though the original academic system was trying to be very mixed initiative, kind of leaving the users say whatever they want, you realize when you shift to a system in the wild that that's not a very good idea. It's going to break most of the time. So we had this approach of saying, first we asked them, okay, what can I do for you? We try to get information. It was kind of a form filling approach, particularly we get as much as we can, and then we go into a directed dialogue where we ask the missing bits and then give the information. And then we also had the follow-up. Once we give a time, you can ask for the next time, previous time. And we were saying, or you can say, start over to restart. And we have a fair number of people that responded, start over to restart, which is not what we meant them to say. We meant them to say, start over to restart. It's just like, and it might be just the way the intonation worked. We had really high quality synthesis, which is very close to recording. It was dedicated for the system. It's part of a research project too. But still, it might be that just the way it sounded, people didn't realize what we meant. That's just how these little things affect. It's little things in the prompt that's going to affect how your NLU works in the end. Like, it's kind of interesting how all these things interact together. We definitely saw a lot of that. In addition to all the swear words, there's some people, particularly older people, probably who just couldn't realize they weren't talking to a person. That like it could take forever, and it wasn't at all passing the Turing test in any way, right? But for some people, they would still, because maybe they had lost their glasses in the bus, and they were probably stressed because of that. They were just trying to talk to our system, which was just trying to provide them bus information, like schedule information, and it kind of never ended. So we saw quite a few of those too.
Yeah, no, I think it's always fascinating once you start to sort of see the real user interaction, sort of based up against whatever the assumption was, and to sort of see that real user interaction, I think is really eye-opening. I think maybe a lot of the realizations you guys had then were probably super eye-opening, but now I think enough people have seen some of those similar ones.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully, right? So sort of transitioning a little bit from, why you got initially interested in the space and, some of the initial successes and realizations as you were able to experiment with real data, what's sort of your vision maybe for like the next 5 to 10 years? Where do you see like all this is going? It could really be as specific or as narrow as you see your vision right now.
Okay, yeah, sure. I think I see at least to start 2 big kind of areas that are very exciting and that are going to happen in the next 5-10 years. On the one hand, there's the kind of the voice only world of like either echo even though, I mean, there's a question of how much the smart displays are going to replace those or not, but it's not really clear yet. But there's also the car case where you're probably going to be voice only for a longer time. So there's all this, which, it didn't used to be like when I was doing my research, like reaching a large audience for a spoken dialogue system was like, you couldn't really figure out how that would happen, right? But now there's 50 million Alexas in people's home, and that's exactly what a dialogue system needs. So that's pretty exciting. Like I know things are not great now in terms of conversational, skills, but if you say 5-10 years, yeah, it's going to happen for sure, and that's pretty exciting. The other thing that gets me excited, it's other work that I've done actually since my thesis, more in my jobs after that, is the multimodal work. And it's another area where I've kind of been wondering why hasn't that happened earlier, because some of that stuff could be like apps on phones or tablets that combine some kind of speech input and touch. And you can have really good and interesting and creative, because in this case, I think it's a little bit different. We're not trying to replicate human conversation. You're trying to create a new interactive model that combines speech and UI and touch. And you can be as creative as you want. It doesn't need to be kind of human-like. It can be, one side is human, but it's just, as long as it's a good user experience, it's great, right? And it works. And I feel there's been so little, not zero, but so little of that happening, even over the past, even 10 years, I feel it could have started, including in products. And so I'm suspecting that that's going to, because there's more and more of speech, more and more of natural language in general, that's going to help that, and that's going to happen too.
Definitely. I absolutely agree with you on all your points. It's the channel first didn't exist. Now the channel is beginning to sort of begin to evolve, and I think they said there's going to be more voice devices this year than wearable devices, which I think is crazy. And the limited amount of time these devices have existed for.
That's right.
It just goes to show the I guess amenability of the end consumer sort of really embracing this technology and literally putting it into their home.
Yes, yeah.
I think that's very encouraging to see that. And then the second thing you said too, in regards to sort of multimodal experiences, I definitely see that is a jump that we need to get to. For whether it's sort of adhering more towards behavior in regards to how people want to interact with companies or brands or technologies on their terms. But in addition to that, also extending the current use cases, that with voice might not really be readily accessible, specifically for what you guys are working on with commerce, right? It's like, buying sort of these commoditized products like soaps or toilet papers or whatever, is passable. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a great experience yet, but then when we begin to see the sort of multi-modality experiences, we see some of the, Google Home or Alexa that have screens and displays, and Alexa even, beginning to build TVs that are going to have that sort of interplay. And I think we can definitely see better user experiences and use cases that get expanded. I think I just triggered my Alexa there, but yeah, so I think sort of moving to current day and sort of seeing that vision and now sort of drawing back in, I think there's an applicability to also sort of looking into what do you sort of see are the current obstacles and challenges, maybe the ones that you would prioritize as sort of the most important ones that people should be looking into and trying to solve.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Very broad question, I know.
There's a number of those. Some are pure, the most exciting ones, I would say, like the technical obstacles that you just have to make conversation work. That's obvious that there's work that needs to happen there, but there's also well-known problems beside that to make it like successful commercially and broadly. In terms of discoverability, I'm not the first one saying that. That's a pretty well-known problem, but it's not really solved yet. I know that Google and Amazon are working very hard because that's very important for them to help solve that, but it's not quite quite there yet. So that's definitely one issue. We've seen issues. The ecosystem is not really mature yet in that, it's not. maybe today is like what the first app store was in 2008, and there are still things to figure out. Like by now, like today, if you build an app, like how the submission process work and how payments work and how all of that, it's pretty well kind of, you know, established, right? And I feel it's not quite the case for Alexa or Google Assistant actions kind of framework. At least that's been our experience, has been that it's much more complicated than you'd think it would be. And so those are probably not purely, they're not conversational problems per se. It's just establishing the right an ecosystem and mechanisms, which there are difficulties because once you're using a speaker, then you only have voice and there's only so much you can do. So you kind of need that second, you know, phone-based experience to search or enable, and how do you make these two work together? It's mostly the problem of Google and Amazon, probably, and Apple, but I think there's a big obstacle to getting these things out in like people's hands. I think the multimodal story on a mobile device, a traditional phone, like smartphone or tablet, is in some way might be kind of a lower hanging fruit because it's kind of within the ecosystem of apps that exist that is much more established. You still have, you know, if you build one of those, you still have discoverability issues, etc. But it's something people are much more used to. So that there might be a shorter term thing that might happen there. But again, for some reason, I mean, it's not an easy thing. One thing is that just the thinking, and maybe that's another obstacle. More of the product design kind of aspect of things. Figuring that out is also a hard thing. So if you think you build an app like today, like a standard mobile app, touch base, you have flows. You kind of control where your how your interaction user experience goes, and product managers are really and designers are really used to that, and they know how to draw that. Now, if you even just say you want to voice enable it, like you have an existing app, you want to voice enable it, the beauty of voice and the whole point of natural language voice is that you can say anything anytime, right? Is that you can bring up things that are not on the screen, that are without any need for an affordance on your phone. But then that means you have to design for that, and that's something that people have to learn. As a community, we have to learn how to do too. So I think that's another aspect of kind of, in a way, missing technology or missing know-how, maybe both the tools and the know-how how to design these kind of voice and natural language applications, whether voice only or multimodal. And yeah, we're trying internally ourselves at B4.AI to kind of figure out and establish these things for ourselves too, right? Now, how do you go from an idea to a feature to an actual implementation in your system that results in enriching all the possible dialogue flows, conversational flows that could happen, right? But how do you go from A to B and track your progress and kind of debug and everything? All that is a little harder, or much harder than it is for other types of applications. So that's another aspect I think that's important.
Definitely. No, I think those are all great, points in regards to obstacles we're currently seeing in the ecosystem. And, I think, just prioritizing them, I think provides a lot of context, to, here are some foundational blocks that we need to somehow figure out some decent solutions so we can sort of move to these next, conversational paradigms per se, right? Maybe ones that we can't even really wrap our heads around yet, because I know certainly when Google decided to show their duplex off, I think that was, who knows if it actually even works, the tech demo itself, but, I think it paints a picture of, what is potentially to come. So I think all your points totally make sense. As far as like best practices, and they could be UX best practices or design or development best practices. Do you have maybe a couple best practices to share in regards to just building bots?
So I don't know if it's a general best practice, but one principle that we try to adhere to at all costs is, in a natural language application, like what we're talking about, the user should be able to say anything anytime. And it's the problem of the bot to handle it in the most graceful way possible, which as little as possible should be, sorry, I didn't get that, or sorry, I can do that for you. Obviously, that's one way of handling it, but you don't want that. And so having that as your because it's not. I'm saying it because it's not obvious. You can design a chatbot like even a natural language based chatbot, and say, well, in order to avoid the problem, we're going to tell them, please say A or B. And I feel that is not a good design approach for a natural language. If you do natural language, I feel you have to go all the way, or at least as far as possible, and say, well, we're going to have to, maybe we can restrict the overall domain, because that's a well kind of understood set of boundaries that the user can wrap their head around. But within that, really you have to, it's on the responsibility is on the bot and on the bot developer to kind of allow anything to happen. And it's a tough one for everyone, for us too. But I feel that that's what's going to bring those things beyond. The worst thing with a voice application is to design a sequential form filling kind of application, right? Where you have to say everything, like one thing, then you ask the next one. This is horrible. This is worse than taking your phone out and tapping it, right? So that's the thing you don't want to do, right? So we have to, as a community and as a general kind of approach to the problem, I think, and I'm not the only one saying that. I know some people are aware of that too, but it's still not, I think, necessarily the general feel you get, at least from using some of the things that are out there.
Definitely. No, I totally agree with that. I think that's a great best practice that, seemingly seems simple, but, in actuality, it has much depth to it, and I think if people just took that one best practice and applied it to half the skills that are on Alexa, I think my Alexa is going to trigger again, but I think many of these, experiences could be vastly improved. As far as recommended resources or educational material, do you have any, books or content to recommend people for them to go ahead and check out?
Sure. So I might show my my inner, not even inner, my conversational geek, because I'm kind of that, meaning that my recommendations might not be. I know some of my practical ones, but I think it'd be great for people in the field, practitioners in the field. I mean, to go back to some of these earlier papers. And it's just interesting because just to realize at least that there are a lot of people in the past, like that goes back, I would say hundreds of years, because linguists have been looking at how people talk to each other for a long time, right? And there's been a lot of smart people looking at that before computers were even around. And so seeing what they saw and what they learned, and even in the more recent version of that, what can be kind of modeled in machines as well. So that Gross and Seiner paper, which is a really foundational paper in computational linguistics, conversational linguistics from 1986, I think, which is called Attention, Intentions, and the Structure of Discourse. It's pretty dry, right, as it goes. And the first time I read it, I was kind of wondering, like, that doesn't tell me how to go and write code to build a system. So what is that helping me for? But over time, I've realized that's what they meant. That's where the stack kind of comes from. That's why they don't really frame it completely as a computational kind of code or pseudocode kind of thing. But they kind of explain all that structure that in conversation, there's like a kind of attentional state where we're paying attention to now, which is probably what the stack is. And there's intentions, like what we have in our head, that are going to kind of help us plan what we do next. And going back to those, even if you've already actually read those, going sometimes back to those things is really kind of, it kind of gives you kind of another fresh, in the end, it gives you a fresh perspective on our current problem. So I think I like that. And another, along the same lines, there's this book. I'm actually trying to find it right now. I might not find it. I might have to post it in the comment about this.
Oh, no worries whatsoever. Feel free to ping it to me after, and I'll make sure to add it in the description. But yeah, no, I
feel about this kind of computational linguistics approach and conversational grounding, which is so relevant to everything we do, which is establishing common ground between two parties in conversation. So what it means to confirm something and what it means to kind of agree on something together, and that's also very, very informative for now applying that to practical systems today.
Absolutely. I know. I think definitely getting into any field, I think sort of looking at the foundation and what were sort of the initial, I guess, seminal pieces of, research studies, I think oftentimes are a good place to start, so I'm certainly going to check that out, and I'm sure much of our audience will be checking out some of those recommendations as well. So much appreciated. At this point, I just want to sort of give you the stage, and feel free to talk about any updates B4.AI is looking to put out, where we can find you guys, maybe speaking at conferences. I know Michael is going to be speaking at Chatbot Summit in Berlin in late October. So if you have anything you want to let the audience know, feel free to do that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so a bunch of news, I guess. We updated our website, which has been so crappy for so long, that now it's actually decent. So if you just want like really high-level information about us and who we are.
Yeah.
So B4.AI, that's the website, that's the URL. We are in the process, interestingly, I think we are now in the process of submitting and getting accepted a Google action called Pizza Pal Lite. And should be there if not today, like in a couple of days or something. Once I've confirmed it's readily available, I can also comment that, and we will put video demos and an announcement for this. But that's kind of our first product that's really available out there for everyone, and we're doing the same with Alexa at the same time. But some of these submission processes are not easy to deal with, to say the least. But we're getting there. So that's Pizza Pal Lite. And we're also, at the same time, so Pizza Pal Lite is basically giving you pricing information for Domino's Pizza's menu. So in terms of usefulness of the product, it's pretty limited as of today, but this is basically showcasing. It does provide real information, but it's mostly to showcase the kind of conversations we can support. And we're working on more actual useful product versions of that for delivering pizza to people. In terms of conferences, yeah, I'll be at the Chatbot Summit as well in Berlin with Michael. And also we have for the academically inclined, we have a demo paper that's been accepted at the EMNLP conference in Belgium I think that's in November. That's the Empirical Methods for Natural Language Processing. It's a big NLP conference. So if anyone goes there, we'll be there with a demo.
Awesome. Cool. I love all the updates, and I definitely look forward to meeting you in person in Berlin at Chatbot Summit, and catching up with Michael and seeing how everything's sort of coming along. And definitely looking forward to hearing either yourself or Michael speak on these topics. I'm sure you guys will have some sort of keynote or speaking position. So I definitely look forward to that. Before I let you go, I always like to ask this question, and I know you alluded to it a little bit when you had mentioned, you just like to work on cool things, and maybe that was sort of an inspiration. But tell me what sort of motivates and inspires you to sort of continue venturing on into sort of the unknown, because I think a lot of people, whether it's in the startup space or whether it's working on emergent technologies in academia or an academic level, what for you sort of keeps you motivated to keep sort of moving forward?
That's a good question. I think it's a combination of two things. First, it's such a cool, yeah, but also unsolved problem. Like, we're not close to solving the general problem of conversation, and it's an infinitely complex problem. You can start dealing with now if you're situated conversation where you actually you have sensors that could be in the home, right? These days, right? Where what's around the person. Now you have to think about when they talk, they might be mentioning objects in the environment, etc. There's just an infinite amount of complexity, and it's always going to be exciting. It's going to progress in that direction. So that definitely keeps me going. But at the same time, the fact that we live now in these times where it's there are like 50 million devices in people's home that they can just have a conversation with. Like technology, the core technologies are so much more ready and available and deployed to the masses than they ever were. That makes it so much more tangible and real. And having real people use the kind of things that I've been seeing in research settings for many years, that is extremely exciting to me too. I really love building something that people really use. And so, it's exciting times.
I love it. I definitely look forward to checking out the pizza app that you guys are going to be releasing. I'll definitely be playing around with that whenever I see it come on the marketplace. But at that, Antoine, I just want to thank you for your time and your insights and your knowledge. I think our audience is definitely going to get a lot out of this podcast, and I definitely look forward to having you on again in the future when you guys have some more updates to showcase. And look forward to meeting you in person at Chatbot Summit in Berlin.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chad.
Thank you. Take care. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.